I built that house with my own 2 hands, well, mostly my hands. I had help from my best friend Derek and my nephew Tommy, but I was there from the foundation to the final nail in the trim work. It took us almost 18 months, working weekends and after hours since I had a full-time job at the time. Every board, every corner, every decision about where the windows would go and how the deck would wrap around the back. I made those choices. We poured our hearts into it. When my daughter was born, I carried her through every room like a proud parent tours a museum. "This is the living room where your mother will teach you to read," I told her. "This is the deck where you'll learn to ride a bike. That master bedroom upstairs, that's where I'll teach you about constellations on summer nights when you can't sleep." The house became more than a structure. It was a chronicle of my life, a physical manifestation of what I could build and provide. It represented stability, legacy, a place where memories would be made. I sold my first business to pay off the mortgage early. I made sacrifices that my wife knew about, and sacrifices she didn't need to know about. I wanted the debt gone, wanted to own it free and clear before I got any older, wanted to know that no matter what happened, we had a secure foundation. The house was supposed to be mine forever, our family anchor point through whatever life threw at us. Then my daughter married someone who saw it differently. He stood in the doorway of the guest room, my office really, the space where I spent my mornings reading the paper and working on my laptop. Sunlight came through the bay window I'd designed myself, hitting the desk at just the right angle. "Get out. We're turning your room into a nursery." His family laughed from the living room downstairs. I could hear them. My daughter didn't say anything. She stood beside him, her face showing nothing, or maybe showing everything, but in a way I'd learned not to read anymore. "These things happen," her silence said. "People grow, people change, priorities shift." "Get out," he repeated, like I hadn't heard him the first time. "We need the space. The baby's coming in 6 months, and we need to start preparing." There was no malice in his voice, which somehow made it worse. He wasn't angry. He was just stating a fact. The way you'd say the trash needs taking out or the car needs an oil change. Your presence in this house is inconvenient and we're removing the problem. Just like that. After everything. 43 years of building. 1 sentence of unbuilding. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, trying to find something in her expression that suggested this came with guilt or hesitation. There was nothing. Just a woman standing next to her husband, waiting for her father to leave. I didn't argue. That's what struck me later, when I replayed the moment 1,000 times. I didn't fight. I didn't say what I wanted to say. I just nodded slowly, closed my laptop and started packing what I could carry. I loaded 3 boxes into my truck, the photographs, some clothes, my files from the desk. I left behind 43 years of living in that house. I left behind the room where I'd taught my daughter to read, the deck where I'd fixed her bicycle countless times, the kitchen where I'd taught her to make pasta from scratch. All of it left behind because her husband wanted to paint walls and set up a crib in the space where I used to exist. That night, alone in my apartment 45 minutes away, my phone rang. It was Derek, my old friend. He didn't call to ask how I was. He called to tell me he'd gotten a call from a builder named Frank who worked with a development company. There was confusion about a property contract. The builder wanted to know why the property holder had cancelled the project. Derek didn't know anything about it. But the builder said the instruction came down that afternoon, right after the family left my daughter's house. He hadn't known whose family, hadn't known about me. He was just reporting that a project worth considerable money was suddenly dead in the water, and the only instruction was to stop all work immediately, cease all costs. I didn't know Derek had recommended me for a project management role on that development. Didn't know he'd given them my background, my credentials, the fact that I'd successfully managed 3 major commercial builds in the past decade. And I didn't know Derek had done this specifically because he was worried about me, because he knew I was drowning after what happened at the house, and he thought work might anchor me. Frank the builder had been impressed with my track record. He wanted to hire me. Derek had told him I was interested. But here's the thing about desperation and pride. Sometimes they're the same animal. I should have called Derek back and thanked him. Should have explained the situation with my daughter, my living arrangement situation, the fact that I'd just become a man without a home. Should have said, yes, I want that job, I need that job. But I was too raw, I was too angry, I was too humiliated. So when Frank called me directly the next morning asking for my availability, I told him the project wasn't right for me. Told him I'd need to pass. Didn't explain anything, just passed. That's when he cancelled it. That's what the confusion was about. He assumed if the lead manager wasn't interested, the project wasn't viable. He told the property holder they were killing it. And the property holder, not knowing why, just accepted it. The first few months after leaving the house were like living in a fog. I found a one-bedroom apartment in a complex where nobody knew me. I worked freelance jobs here and there, nothing permanent, nothing that required me to be part of a team or explain my situation to anyone. My wife, Emma, she tried to support me, but there was a distance between us now. We'd been married 23 years at that point, and she understood grief, but this was a different kind. This was shame wrapped in rejection, wrapped in the specific cruelty of being removed from the home you'd built by the man your daughter had chosen over you. Emma suggested I reach out to my daughter, suggested she might not have known how her husband's words would hit me. Maybe there's a conversation to be had, she said gently. Maybe he didn't realize what that space meant to you, but I wasn't ready for conversations. I was learning to be angry. I was learning to be bitter. I was learning that I'd spent 43 years building a future for someone who'd made a choice about my place in it, and that place didn't include physical space. The months stretched. I stopped mentioning my daughter around Emma. The holidays came and we didn't see her. She didn't reach out. No calls on my birthday. No messages asking how I was doing. It was as if that statement in my doorway had been a final statement, a period at the end of a sentence. Your fatherhood has an expiration date. We've reached it. Find somewhere else to be. I started running again in the morning, something I hadn't done in 5 years. I started going to the gym, not because I thought it would help me feel better, but because I didn't know what else to do with the anger that was building in my chest like pressure behind a dam. I'd be on the treadmill at 6 in the morning, sweat pouring off me, and I'd think about all the ways I'd failed. Failed to see that my daughter didn't respect me. Failed to understand that providing shelter was temporary, that love had conditions and expiration dates. Failed to realize that everything I'd built meant nothing to the people I'd built it for. And then I'd think about him, my son-in-law. He'd walked into my house a decade ago and systematically dismantled my position in it. In the beginning it was subtle. Little comments about how my presence at family dinners made Emma uncomfortable because she wanted alone time with her daughter. Suggestions that I was too controlling about how the nursery should be designed, even though it was my house. Complaints that my morning routine was loud and woke up their guests. 1,000 tiny cuts that I had absorbed because I didn't want to be the difficult father-in-law. I didn't want to be the problem. But I was the problem. I was the problem because I existed in a space he decided should belong to someone else. His needs had grown, his family had expanded, and I was taking up square footage he could monetize or repurpose. I was the obstacle. I'd built the foundation he was standing on, and now he wanted me off the property. 3 months in, I got a call from my lawyer. My wife had filed for divorce. Not because anything had changed between us, but because she couldn't watch what was happening to me and stay in a house we'd built together. She couldn't stand the silence at dinner. She couldn't bear the weight of me sitting on the couch at night, staring at nothing. A man hollowed out by the recognition that he had wasted his life building for people who didn't want him. So she left. Divided the assets cleanly because that's who Emma was, fair and practical even in her sadness. The settlement was generous. She didn't take the house, though it was hers to take. She knew. She knew what it meant to me, or what it had meant before my daughter and her husband repurposed it. I could buy her out if I wanted to. I could own it completely. But I didn't want to. I didn't want to drive by that street. I didn't want to see the nursery lights through the window. I didn't want to imagine them in the kitchen, making coffee in the morning, standing in the space where I'd taught my daughter to make pasta. So I let Emma keep the house. We signed the papers on a Tuesday. It was the longest Tuesday of my life. 4 months after I left, Derek called again. He said Frank the builder had been asking about me. Said he'd finally figured out why I'd turned down the project. Said he understood now, or at least understood better than he had. He wanted to give me another shot. This time a bigger project. This time with better terms. This time with the understanding that I had a life, that people had reasons for their choices, and that maybe I was just having a bad day when I'd said no the first time. I told Derek I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I let the call sit for 2 weeks. Derek called again. Frank called directly, left a message, then another message, then a third. The opportunity, he said, wouldn't wait forever. Opportunities never do. I thought about that irony. That's what my son-in-law had said to me once the first year they were married. Opportunities don't wait forever. You have to grab them when they come or they pass you by. At the time, he was talking about some business venture, some investment opportunity, but I understood he was talking about me, about my position in the family, about the fact that if I didn't accept his place, his role, his gradual expansion into every space I'd created, then my opportunity to remain would pass. And it had. The opportunity had passed. My daughter had chosen, my wife had chosen, even my home had been chosen for, taken from, repurposed without me. So when Frank called the 4th time, I answered. I told him I was interested. I told him I was ready. What I didn't tell him was that I was broken, that I was operating on rage and a desire to feel useful again, that I was willing to work 70-hour weeks if it meant not going back to my apartment at night. The project was massive. A commercial waterfront development with 3 mixed-use buildings. Frank needed someone who understood timeline management, logistics, vendor relationships, and cost control. He needed credibility, someone who could make contractors listen. He needed someone who wouldn't fall apart under pressure. Frank didn't know he was hiring a man with nothing left to lose. I was on site by 6 every morning, stayed until 9 at night, took calls on weekends. I went through 3 site managers because I was unforgiving of mistakes. The project came in 6 weeks early and under budget. 3 months after completion, Frank offered me another opportunity, a bigger one. Could I commit to 2 years? Could I relocate? There was a large-scale residential development an hour north, 1,200 units across 15 acres. He wanted me to lead it. He wanted me to be the face of the company. He wanted to cement both our names in the industry. I said yes without hesitation. Relocation meant leaving behind the apartment, the failed marriage, the ghost of my daughter who hadn't called in a year. Relocation meant a fresh start, a new city, a place where nobody knew me and nobody knew what I'd lost. I bought a modest house outside the new city. Not the kind of house I would have built. A simple contemporary structure, nothing I'd designed, nothing I'd poured my heart into. It was functional. It was mine. I rented out my half of Emma's house back in the old city and used that income to start building a new life. The kind of life where you don't attach meaning to objects or spaces. The kind of life where home is temporary. I was good at the work, really good. Better than I'd ever been before. Maybe it was because I didn't care anymore if things fell apart. When you've already lost everything that matters, there's a certain freedom in walking into impossible situations and solving them. I wasn't afraid of failure. Failure had already happened in the ways that counted, so I could take risks. I could make bold decisions. I could fire contractors mid-project and retrain their crews. I could demand excellence because I had nothing else to give. The project came together beautifully. A model community with parks and schools and a real sense of place. Frank made millions. The company expanded. And I became the person everyone called when something needed fixing, when a deadline needed pushing, when the pressure was on and stakes were high. But that's when things started getting complicated again. A year into the project, my daughter called. Not my ex-wife, my daughter. She was pregnant. She was having complications. She was scared, and she needed her father. The voice on the phone wasn't the young woman who'd stood next to her husband while he told me to leave. This was someone different, someone broken down by fear and hormones and the sudden understanding that family wasn't optional. I listened to her cry. I let her explain about the bed rest, the doctor's concerns, the possibility that something could go wrong. I listened to all of it, and when she finished, I didn't know what to say. I'd spent a year learning how to hate her. I'd spent a year building a new identity as a man who didn't have a daughter, and now here she was, asking me to come back, asking me to be the father I'd apparently already stopped being. I told her I was in the middle of a major project. I told her I couldn't leave. I told her the things you tell someone when you're protecting yourself. And then I hung up. Not rudely, not dramatically. I just quietly hung up and went back to work. That's when I discovered what I was capable of. That's when I learned I could hurt people the way I'd been hurt. That's when I realized revenge didn't have to be complicated or planned. Sometimes revenge is just the cold refusal to help someone when they need you most. My daughter didn't call again after that. Neither did my ex-wife. But then something changed. Frank came to me with a new opportunity. He wanted to expand the company. He wanted to franchise the model I'd created. He wanted to build multiple developments across the region, and he wanted me to oversee the whole thing. It would mean a promotion, a significant salary increase, stock options, a partnership track. It would mean I'd be set financially for the rest of my life. It would mean I'd finally built something that made real money, real wealth. It would mean I'd succeeded in the way my son-in-law understood success. Money, power, the ability to take things and make them yours. Frank asked me to shake his hand and seal the deal. He asked me to look him in the eye and promise I'd build an empire with him. And I did exactly that. I made the promise. I took the handshake. I committed to 5 more years of my life dedicated to this expansion. What I didn't tell Frank was that I had already decided what I was going to do with that empire when it was built. What I didn't tell him was that this wasn't about the money anymore. This was about power. This was about having enough leverage to hurt the people who'd hurt me. This was about engineering a situation where my son-in-law would realize he'd made a grave mistake in underestimating the man he'd thrown out of his house. He had no idea what was coming for him. The first signs came 6 months into the expansion. The builder I'd recommended, a subcontractor named Marcus who worked on several of our major projects, reached out to me through email. He wanted to tell me something off the record. There was someone asking about my projects. Someone asking about my contracts, my relationships with suppliers, my reputation in the industry. Someone who seemed very interested in my business model and my connections. Marcus didn't have a name, but he had a description. Man in his 40s, aggressive negotiator, asking questions that seemed designed to gather intelligence rather than create business opportunities. Marcus was smart enough to know when he was being pumped for information. I knew exactly who that was. My son-in-law had gotten into real estate development. He'd built on the success my daughter inherited from me, using the money and the property I'd left behind to start his own ventures. And now he was researching me. He was trying to understand what I'd built, how I'd done it, where the vulnerabilities were. He was trying to position himself to compete. Or maybe he was just trying to understand the man he'd thrown out of his house, wondering if I'd made something of myself. I didn't contact him directly. I didn't acknowledge that I knew he was watching. Instead, I called Frank and told him I wanted to accelerate the timeline. I wanted to move faster on 3 new projects that were still in planning stages. I wanted to make commitments with prime contractors and secure land rights before winter. I wanted to build a moat around the business that would be impossible for a newcomer to penetrate. Frank asked why the sudden urgency. I told him we needed to move fast to capture market share. I told him competitors were circling. I told him every half-true thing that would push him toward expansion at scale. Frank agreed. He trusted my instincts. That trust was the first real weapon I had. Over the next 2 years, I systematized the business. I created processes that could be replicated across multiple developments. I built relationships with contractors and suppliers that were so strong, nobody could undercut them without significant capital and time. I created a reputation in the regional market that was unassailable. Banks wanted to work with us. Government agencies expedited our permits. Other developers watched what we were doing and tried to copy it, but they were always a few steps behind. I was building something real, something that would last, something that had weight and substance and power, and the entire time I was thinking about my son-in-law. I was thinking about how he'd looked when he'd thrown me out. I was thinking about the casual cruelty in his voice. I was thinking about my daughter standing beside him, saying nothing. I was thinking about all of it, and I was building a fortress of success that would make him understand what he'd lost when he chose to discard me. Then, in the 3rd year of the expansion, I discovered something. My ex-wife Emma called me out of the blue. She'd moved on. She was with someone else. She was happy, or she was pretending to be happy, which amounts to the same thing when you've been married to someone as long as we were. She called because she thought I should know. My daughter's marriage was falling apart. My son-in-law had overextended himself financially. He'd made bad investments. He'd borrowed heavily on the property, the house I'd built, trying to fund his own development projects. And now the market was shifting. Interest rates were rising. His projects weren't getting financed. He was facing foreclosure on the primary residence and the business was going under. He was desperate. More desperate than he'd been when he'd thrown his father-in-law out into the world. Emma said my daughter was devastated. She was pregnant with their 2nd child, and her husband was losing everything. She wanted to reach out to me. She wanted to ask if there was anything I could do. Emma knew I was successful now. She was gently suggesting that maybe I could help. Maybe I could use my connections, my resources, my new leverage in the industry to save my son-in-law from financial ruin. And in that moment, with the phone pressed to my ear and my ex-wife's hopeful voice in my ear, I understood what I'd become. I'd become the exact thing he was now, desperate, positioned to make choices based on self-interest rather than love, willing to sacrifice anything to survive. The irony was exquisite. He'd kicked me out to protect his financial position. Now his financial position was what would be kicked out from under him, and I had the power to stop it. I had the power to save him. I had the power to let him fail. "I'll think about it," I told Emma. I didn't think about it. I already knew what I was going to do. I called Frank that afternoon with an investment opportunity. A commercial site with residential potential, great location, motivated seller willing to move fast at below market value. The kind of deal that only comes once in a career. Frank asked for details. I gave him the address and history. What I didn't tell him was that the site was directly across from one of my son-in-law's failed projects. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already put in a preliminary bid to control the property. What I didn't tell him was that I was about to use my company's full resources to block every path toward his recovery. I was going to take control of the market around him. I was going to make it impossible for him to move, pivot, or find alternative financing. I was going to systematically eliminate his options until he had nowhere left to turn. And then, when he was at his lowest point, I would consider whether he deserved my help. I would make him understand what it felt like to be unwanted in a home you'd built. I would make him understand what it cost to throw away the one person who'd given you everything. Frank approved the acquisition. He trusted my judgment completely. And with that approval, I set the final pieces into motion. Everything I'd built, everything I'd worked toward was now positioned to come down on his head like a hammer. The collapse happened faster than I expected. Within weeks of Frank's acquisition, the market tightened around my son-in-law like a noose. The property across from his failed project went into our portfolio, and suddenly his options dried up. He couldn't access financing because the banks looked at the geography around him and saw a competitor moving in with serious capital. He couldn't pivot to new projects because the contractors he'd worked with had already signed exclusivity agreements with my company. He couldn't move his money around because I'd systematically purchased or optioned every viable development site within a 10-mile radius of his existing holdings. I watched it all from a distance, tracking his movements through industry contacts and marketplace reports. Commercial Pro, Purty he'd tried to secure went to us. A residential development he'd been pitching to investors suddenly faced permitting delays because I'd requested environmental impact studies through channels that weren't mine but were certainly influenced by connections I'd cultivated. I knew the exact moment his credit line was revoked because Derek mentioned it casually over coffee, saying he'd heard through mutual acquaintances that a developer in our old market had lost access to capital. I knew when his investors sued him because the story made regional business news. I knew when the foreclosure notice was filed because I set up a Google alert on his name, something I'd done months earlier, obsessively checking it multiple times a day. The market has a way of moving in patterns, and if you want to understand those patterns well enough, you can create currents that pull people where you want them to go. My son-in-law was being pulled under, and he had no idea I'd engineered the tide. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt something closer to nausea. I kept thinking about that moment in my doorway, his hand pointing toward the guest room. Get out. The casualness of it haunted me more than any dramatic confrontation could have. He hadn't been angry. He hadn't been cruel in an obvious way. He'd just been a man stating facts. Your room doesn't fit our plans. Your presence is inefficient. We're optimizing the space. Every night I'd lie in my bed in the modest house I'd bought, and I'd think about how that sentence had dismantled me, how it had broken my mind, marriage, how it had destroyed the meaning I'd built into the ground I'd built on, and now I was doing exactly the same thing to him. I was pointing at his life and saying, get out. I was taking his room, his security, his future, and repurposing it. The irony should have been satisfying. It wasn't. The first few months were the worst because I could still feel something resembling victory. The local real estate market started carrying stories about how my company was the new player changing everything. Frank's picture was in trade publications. My name was mentioned as the strategic force behind the expansion. Industry analysts were talking about the company as a model, a case study in rapid market penetration. And all of it was built on destroying one man's life. I'd get messages from industry contacts asking how I'd managed to lock down so much property so quickly. What was my secret? What was the strategy? They wanted to learn, wanted to replicate the model, wanted to understand how I'd seen the opportunity when nobody else had. Nobody asked if I'd seen a person instead of an opportunity. Nobody asked if there were consequences to my strategy beyond the quarterly returns. I'd spend hours in the office at night long after everyone had gone home, and I'd pull up property records, financing documents, public records. I'd track the legal filings for his company. I'd watch the notices of default accumulate. I'd see his name attached to lawsuits from creditors. Each one was a small victory in the war I'd been waging. Each one was another proof that I was winning. But winning what? What did I win when he lost his credit rating? When his investors sued him for misrepresenting their returns? When the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the house? What did I win when my daughter's life fell apart because her husband couldn't sleep anymore, couldn't function, couldn't be the person she'd married? I didn't know the answer. I just knew that I'd spent 3 years planning for this moment, and now that it was here, it didn't feel anything like I'd imagined. The first thing I noticed was how little satisfaction there actually was in watching him struggle. I'd imagined this for so long. Imagined the moment when he'd realize his mistakes, when he'd finally understand what he'd taken from me. But now that it was happening, it felt hollow. The problems cascaded one after another. His primary project couldn't secure financing because the lending environment I'd helped create made him too risky. His investors pulled out. The property he'd leveraged against my house, the one he'd taken while throwing me out, became a liability instead of an asset. Interest rates climbed, his debt multiplied, and somewhere in the middle of all this, my daughter came crawling back. Not to me directly. Emma told me first. My daughter had called her, hysterical, asking if Emma had any way to get a message to me. Could I help them? Could I loan them money? Could I do something, anything, to prevent them from losing everything? Emma said my daughter's voice had been broken. She said my daughter had been crying so hard she could barely speak. She said my daughter had asked about me, asked if I ever asked about her, asked if I remembered that I'd once been a father who loved unconditionally. The first time Emma called with this news, I told her I had to go. I hung up and I sat in my office with the door closed, and I couldn't process what I was feeling. My daughter was suffering. My daughter was desperate. My daughter wanted her father, and I was the reason she couldn't have him because I'd been too consumed with building my own success to be available when he needed me. But that wasn't the whole truth either, was it? I hadn't just been building a business. I'd been building a weapon. I'd been systematically constructing the circumstances that led to her suffering. Every decision I'd made, every property I'd acquired, every contractor I'd brought into my network, all of it had been designed with one purpose in mind: to destroy the man she'd married, to make him understand what it meant to be unwanted, to make him learn the lesson I'd learned. And in the process, I'd made sure my daughter would be destroyed right along with him. And then Derek called. Not with an offer of work this time, with news. Frank wanted to meet with me. There was a situation with one of our subcontractors that needed discussion. A sensitive matter that required my discretion. Derek's voice sounded careful when he said this, like he was picking his words deliberately. When I arrived at Frank's office the next morning, I expected business discussion. What I got was something else entirely. Frank's lawyer was present, which was unusual. Frank had a conscience, or at least he had a lawyer who'd told him he might need one. He'd been contacted by someone representing a developer in financial distress. The developer in question had been trying to negotiate with us about the properties surrounding his holdings. The developer had asked for a meeting. The developer wanted to propose a partnership instead of competition. The developer wanted to talk about restructuring, about finding ways to work together, about survival. The developer's name was my son-in-law, and Frank wanted to know if I knew him. The moment Frank said the name, I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief, not victory, something else, something that felt like vertigo, like standing on the edge of something and suddenly understanding the height. Frank said the man had sounded broken on the phone. Frank said he'd heard crying in the background during the call, a woman's voice, a child asking questions. Frank said the man had explained his situation, the bad investments, the over-leveraging, the circumstances that had led to his current predicament. Frank said the SSUM, and had specifically asked if Frank knew anyone named me, if Frank had worked with me before. Frank said the man had mentioned that he knew I was in the region, and that if there was any possibility, any chance at all, that I might be willing to partner with him, he'd be interested in exploring it. He'd be willing to do almost anything to keep his family from losing their home. The second he said the name, I understood what I'd done. I'd been so focused on the mechanics of the trap that I hadn't considered the gravity of springing it. My son-in-law was desperate. Desperate enough to reach out to Frank. Desperate enough to probably beg. Desperate enough to do whatever it took to survive. In that moment, I saw him as he actually was. Not the man who'd thrown me out of my house. Not the man who'd taken everything from me. Not the villain of the story I'd been telling myself for years. Just a man who'd made bad decisions, bad investments, and found himself boxed in by forces he didn't understand and couldn't control. A man who'd made one terrible choice in a moment of ambition and had been paying for it ever since. A man, I realized, not so different from me. A man, who'd become exactly what I'd become when my daughter kicked me out. Desperate, broken, willing to do anything to keep his life from completely collapsing. I thought about my grandson. I'd never met my grandson, never held him, never watched him learn to walk or speak or understand the world. My daughter had tried to introduce me once, years ago, but I'd refused. I'd been too angry, too wounded, too convinced that accepting any gesture toward reconciliation would be weakness. And now that boy was facing potential homelessness because I'd engineered his father's financial destruction. My grandson was going to grow up with trauma because I needed revenge. Frank asked me what he should do. Frank said the man had seemed genuinely distraught on the phone. Frank said maybe there was a business opportunity. Opportunity here, a way to consolidate instead of compete. A partnership that could be beneficial for everyone. Frank said the man had asked very specifically if Frank thought there was any chance at reconciliation, any possibility that the situation wasn't hopeless. Frank's lawyer added that from a legal standpoint, assisting in the restructuring would actually position us well, would look good to regulators, would demonstrate corporate good faith, and I realised in that moment that I could end it. I could nod at Frank and say, yes, let's bring him in. I could be the bigger man. I could be the one who chose mercy instead of vengeance. I could be the person my daughter needed me to be when she came back to me, broken and apologising. I could choose to be different. I could be someone my grandson could respect. Or I could choose to finish what I'd started. I could tell Frank no. I could tell him that this developer didn't deserve a partnership, didn't deserve mercy, didn't deserve anything but the ruins of his own poor decisions. I could tell Frank to crush him completely. I could make sure that my son-in-law lost everything, the way he tried to make me lose everything in that moment in my doorway when he'd pointed and said, "Get out." I could know that I'd done it deliberately, that I'd orchestrated it, that I'd won. I sat in Frank's office with his lawyer watching me, waiting for my decision, and I felt the weight of every choice I'd made for the past 3 years settling on my shoulders. And I realised that the choice I made in that moment would define not just my son-in-law's future, but mine. Not just whether he'd recover or be destroyed, but what kind of man I'd become. He showed up at my office 3 days later. Not through Frank. Through my assistant, who told me there was a man in the lobby asking specifically for me, saying it was urgent, saying he was willing to wait as long as it took. I almost didn't see him. I almost told my assistant to send him away, to tell him I was too busy, to tell him to contact Frank through proper channels. But something made me go downstairs. Something made me want to look him in the eye one more time. He was sitting in one of the lobby chairs and he looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His suit was expensive but wrinkled. His face was gaunt. There was a desperation in his eyes that I recognised because I'd seen it in my own mirror. He stood up when he saw me, and for a moment we just looked at each other across that lobby. I could see the calculations running behind his eyes. He was trying to figure out if I was an enemy or if I was someone he could negotiate with. He was trying to figure out if throwing me out of my house had damaged him enough that he needed to apologise. He was trying to figure out what I wanted from him. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. "Can we talk somewhere private?" he asked. His voice was rough, like he'd been crying or hadn't used it in days. I took him to a conference room on the 4th floor. We sat across from each other at a table meant for business discussions, and he started talking. He talked about the financial pressure he'd been under, the investments that had gone wrong, the debt that had spiraled out of control. He talked about how he'd made mistakes, bad decisions, how he'd thought things would work out differently. He talked about how he'd been trying to build something, trying to be successful, trying to provide for his family. He talked about the fear that kept him awake at night, the possibility that he might lose the house, the place where his children had been born, where his wife had painted the nursery, where he'd imagined they'd grow old together. He talked about how every conversation with his accountant was worse than the last, how every call from a creditor was another small death. And then he started talking about me. He said he knew I'd been in the region. He said he'd heard about my projects, my success, the reputation I'd built. He said it had taken him a while to understand, but he'd finally figured it out. He'd realised that too many coincidences had aligned against him. Too many deals had fallen through at exactly the wrong moments. Too many contractors had suddenly become unavailable. He'd realised it probably wasn't coincidence at all. He said my daughter had told him about the call I'd received when she was pregnant, the one where I'd said I was too busy. He said she'd told him that she'd regretted asking because she knew I was building something important. He said he understood now that I hadn't been wrong to prioritise my work. He said he understood now that business required sacrifice, required focus, required you to be cold sometimes. He said he was asking for that coldness to be directed somewhere else. He was asking for partnership. He was asking for mercy. He was asking if there was any way we could work together instead of against each other. He said he was willing to accept responsibility for kicking me out. He said he'd been a different man then, younger, more ambitious, more foolish. He said he'd been trying to prove something to himself, and he'd done it by taking things away from people. He said he'd learned what that felt like now. He said he knew what it meant to be pushed out, to be unwanted, to realise that the ground you're standing on could shift at any moment. And I realised what he didn't know. I realised he had no idea that the trap he was in was one I'd built specifically for him. I realised he thought his problems were just market conditions, just bad luck, just the natural outcome of his own mistakes. He had no idea that I'd orchestrated every single barrier he'd faced. He had no idea that he was sitting across from the architect of his own destruction. He'd figured out that something wasn't random, but he didn't know the extent of my involvement. He didn't know that I'd spent 3 years carefully constructing the circumstances he now found himself drowning in. The knowledge of that, the power of it, suddenly felt disgusting to me. I told him I needed time to think about it. I told him to leave his number with my assistant. I told him I'd be in touch. He nodded, exhausted, grateful for even the possibility of hope. He wrote his number on a piece of paper with shaking hands and left it on the table. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. He said he was sorry. He said he knew sorry was probably too little and far too late. He said he was sorry that he'd treated me the way he had. He said he was sorry that he'd made my daughter choose between us. He said he was sorry that it took financial ruin to teach him what he should have learned a long time ago. And then he left. I sat there in the conference room for a long time after he was gone, and I felt something shift inside me. I thought about my daughter. I thought about Emma. I thought about Derek. I thought about all the time I'd spent building this trap, all the hours of planning, all the careful moves designed to break this man the way my daughter's silence had broken me. I thought about my grandson, the child I'd never met, the person who'd inherited this conflict without choosing it. And I thought about the fact that I'd become willing to destroy a family, to cause suffering to a grandchild I'd never met, just to prove something to a man who'd already made his point. He'd thrown me out. That was the fact. He'd won that round. He'd made me leave my house. He'd humiliated me in front of his family. He'd forced me to start over, and I'd survived. More than survived. I'd built something real and powerful and lasting. I'd proven that I was more than the room he'd taken away from me. So what was I still doing? Why was I still hunting him? Why was I still trying to make him understand what he'd done? Because some part of me wanted to stay victimized. Some part of me wanted to be the man who'd been wronged, who had every right to be angry, who was justified in his cruelty because cruelty had been shown to him first. But that part of me was tired. I was tired. I was tired of carrying this anger. I was tired of using it to fuel decisions that made me feel powerful and hollow at the same time. I was tired of being the man who'd been thrown out of his house. It was time to be something else. It was time to be the man I wanted my grandson to know. That night, I didn't call Frank to tell him to finish crushing my son-in-law. That night, I sat alone in my modest house, the one I'd bought that meant nothing to me, and I held that piece of paper with his phone number on it. And I made a decision. I called Emma. I asked her if my daughter was still trying to reach me. Emma said yes. She said my daughter called at least once a week. She said my daughter was in therapy, trying to process everything, trying to figure out how to be a person who'd betrayed her father and then been abandoned by him when she needed him most. She said my daughter had asked Emma if she thought I'd ever forgive her. She said my daughter still loved me, even though she'd hurt me, even though she'd stood silent while her husband threw me out. Emma said my daughter's ball has broken because she'd lost both of us, her father to anger and her husband to financial ruin, and she was drowning in a situation where everyone she loved had become a casualty. And I realised that I'd already forgiven her. I'd forgiven her the moment she'd called me that first time when she was pregnant and scared. I'd just been too angry to admit it. I told Emma to give me my daughter's number. I told her I was going to call. I told her I was going to tell my daughter that I loved her, that I'd made mistakes too, that I was ready to try again, that I was going to try to be the father she'd been reaching out to, and I told Emma something else. I told her that I was going to make a different choice. I told her that I was going to do something that my son-in-law hadn't done when he'd had. The power to be kind. I told her that I was going to show mercy. What I didn't tell her was that showing mercy to him wasn't about his redemption. It was about mine. It wasn't about giving him a second chance or forgetting what he'd done. It was about giving myself permission to stop being the person he'd made me become. It was about breaking the cycle. It was about understanding that when someone throws you out of your house, you can build a new one. But if you spend all your time trying to throw them out of theirs, you never get to live in the new house. You're always back in the place where they threw you out, just standing on their side of the door instead of yours. That's when I understood what I really wanted. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted my life back. I wanted my daughter back. I wanted to be a grandfather to the child I'd never met. I wanted to stop living in the moment of my eviction and start living in the moments that came after it. The moments where I'd survived, where I'd thrived, where I'd built something real. But I'd been so focused on the trap that I'd forgotten to actually live inside the new house I'd built. And that night, I decided to change that. I decided to close one chapter and open a new one. I decided that some victories weren't worth winning if winning meant losing everything that mattered. I called my daughter that night. I sat on the edge of my bed in that house that still felt like it belonged to someone else, and I dialed the number Emma had given me, and I heard my daughter's voice answer on the second ring, and I realised she'd been waiting by the phone. "Dad," she said, her voice cracking immediately. Just hearing me say her name through the line broke her. "I'm sorry," she started, but I stopped her. "No more apologies," I said. "Not from you. I made my mistakes. I chose anger when I should have chosen love. I chose to stay broken when you were asking me to heal." She was crying now. The kind of crying that comes from months of holding everything in. The kind that only happens when someone finally gives you permission to fall apart, and I told her I loved her. I told her I was sorry for missing her calls. I told her I was sorry for being so consumed with my own pain that I couldn't see hers. I told her I wanted to meet my grandson. I wanted to see what she'd built with her life, even if it hadn't gone the way she planned. I wanted to be her father again. We talked for hours. She told me about the house situation, about how they were facing foreclosure, about how the bank had sent notices and the contractors had stopped calling and everything was falling apart. She told me how scared she was, how her husband had become someone she didn't recognize, someone consumed by financial panic and shame and the crushing weight of failure. She told me she still loved him, but she didn't know if love was enough to fix what was broken. She told me about late nights when he'd see her, tea at the kitchen table, just staring at bills, paralysed by the numbers. She told me about the moment she realised her dream house, the one they'd bought when they were young and hopeful and believed the future would always be bright. That dream was about to be taken away. And I listened to every word and I felt the weight of what I'd done settle over me like a physical thing, like gravity suddenly doubling and pulling me down into the earth. I'd engineered this suffering. My grandson was going to lose his home because I needed revenge. My daughter was going to have her marriage destroyed because I couldn't let go of anger. And my son-in-law would spend years rebuilding from nothing because I'd spent 3 years carefully constructing his downfall. The irony was that by punishing him, I was also punishing the two people I loved most in the world. I was punishing them for loving the wrong person, and they didn't deserve that. When we hung up, I told her I was going to help. I didn't tell her how, I just told her that everything was going to be okay, that I was going to make sure of it. She asked me what I meant, but I said I'd explain soon, in person, when I came to see my grandson for the first time. The next morning Frank called. He said the developer had left several messages on his voicemail. He said the man sounded increasingly desperate. He said maybe there was something to explore here, something that could be mutually beneficial. I told Frank I wanted to meet with him and the developer's representatives. Frank seemed surprised but agreed. He set up the meeting for that afternoon. When my son-in-law walked into the conference room, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were hollow. His hands shook as he extended one toward me. He'd brought his accountant, a nervous man who kept adjusting his glasses. He'd brought paperwork, thick folders stuffed with financial documents and projections and restructuring proposals. He'd brought evidence of his willingness to work with us instead of against us. He'd brought desperation. He sat across from me and Frank and he pitched everything he had left. He talked about properties in careful, measured tones, like he was afraid his voice might crack if he let too much emotion bleed through. He talked about joint ventures. He talked about market conditions and timing and why this particular moment represented an opportunity for partnership instead of competition. He talked about how if we could just restructure his debt, if we could just give him access to capital again, if we could just believe in him one more time, he could turn this around. He could rebuild. He could be solvent again. And I watched him pitch his own survival to the man whose life he had tried to destroy all those years ago, though he didn't know that's what he was doing. I watched him sell his humiliation like it was a business plan. I watched desperation dressed up in professional language. Frank kept glancing at me, waiting for me to respond. His lawyer sat beside him, neutral and observant, and I realized in that moment that I had absolute power. I could nod and save him, or I could shake my head and let him drown. I had his life in my hands exactly the way he'd thought he had mine in his that day when he pointed at the guest room and said, "Get out." I could make him understand what it meant to lose everything. I could make him suffer through years of rebuilding the way I'd suffered. I could win completely and permanently. I could be the man who destroyed him so thoroughly that he'd never recover. I could spend the next decade watching him try to climb out of the hole I'd created and fail again and again. And in that moment, I understood that if I did that, if I took that power and used it the way I'd planned to, I would become exactly the person I hated. I would become the person who threw someone out of their house just because I could. I would become cruel in exactly the same way he'd been cruel. The only difference would be that I'd have years to think about it while he suffered. I told Frank I needed a moment alone with the developer. After they left, after his accountant had shuffled out nervously and the lawyer had stepped into the hallway, I looked at my son-in-law across that conference table and he straightened, bracing himself for the rejection he obviously expected. I could see it in his face. He knew he was about to lose. "Listen," I said. "I know what I did. I know what the last 3 years looked like from the outside. I orchestrated your financial situation. I purchased or optioned every viable property that could have saved you. I made sure your investors learned about your over-leveraging. I made sure your access to credit dried up. Every single barrier you've hit, I put there deliberately." He went pale. I could see him processing this information, understanding the scope of my vendetta. And I realized that he'd known something was wrong, but he hadn't understood the depth of the planning, the precision of the trap. It was like watching someone realize they're drowning not by accident, but by design. "You tried to destroy me," I continued. "You threw me out of my house in front of your family. You humiliated me. You took something away from me that I thought was permanent. But here's what you didn't understand. I didn't need that house. I needed you to understand that I could survive without it. And I did. I built something real, something that gave me power and purpose, and I used that power to hurt you the exact same way you hurt me. And you know what? It didn't feel the way I thought it would. It felt hollow. It felt like I was just repeating the same cruelty in a different pattern. It felt like I was becoming you." He stared at me without speaking. I could see his mind working behind his eyes, trying to figure out where this was going, whether I was about to crush him with the full weight of my revenge or whether I was offering something else. The gears were turning. He was looking for the trap, and he couldn't find one, which made him even more nervous. "I'm going to make you an offer," I said. "A real one. Not a trap. Not another mechanism to destroy you. A genuine business opportunity. We restructure your debt. You partner with my company. We develop the properties together. You get a stake in the success. But there are conditions, and they're non-negotiable. First, you pay me back the rental income you never gave me. All those years you lived in the house I built. Every month you owe me rent for that guest room I was evicted from. Second, you sign a document acknowledging that you failed as a son-in-law and as a businessman and that you're willing to learn from those failures. I don't need you to grovel. I just need you to tell the truth. Third, you go to therapy. Real therapy. Not just going through the motions to make your wife happy. Why? You figure out why you felt like you had to throw me out of my house to feel powerful. You figure out why you thought destroying someone else's dignity was the same as building your own. Fourth, and this is the most important one, you actually become the man your wife and your children deserve. Not for me, for them, for your son, for my grandson, who I've never met. Your kid shouldn't grow up knowing his father crushed his grandfather and then got crushed back in return. Your kid should grow up knowing his father made a mistake and learned from it. That's redemption. That's what I'm offering you. He started crying. Just broke down right there in the conference room, his face crumpling like someone had pulled a string, and suddenly he wasn't a businessman anymore, wasn't the person who'd thrown me out of my house. He was just a man who'd failed and realised that failure had cost him more than he could calculate. I handed him tissues from the box on the table, and I waited for him to compose himself, and I realised that what I'd been looking for wasn't revenge at all. I'd been looking for acknowledgement. I'd been looking for him to understand what he'd done, and to be genuinely sorry for it. And once I had that, once I saw the genuine remorse, I couldn't keep torturing him. Not if it meant my daughter kept suffering. Not if it meant my grandson grew up in a house full of fear and desperation. Not if it meant I had to keep being the person I'd become to maintain this trap. We shook hands on the deal. Frank's lawyer drew up papers. Within 2 weeks, we'd restructured everything. My son-in-law was back in the game. He wasn't wealthy, but he was solvent. His family wasn't facing foreclosure anymore, and my daughter had her husband back. Or at least she had the possibility of rebuilding him into someone better than he'd been. But that's not the end of the story. Not entirely. A few weeks later, he called the builder I'd been working with. The same builder who'd been scheduled to start the project that I'd stopped. He pulled him aside and told him everything. He told him about the tape measure he had used to mark the property lines. He told him about the emails I'd sent designed to poison relationships. He told him about the careful orchestration that had destroyed his business. And the builder, this older man named Robert, called me one evening. He said he wanted to meet. I thought he was going to tell me off. I thought he was going to demand payment for the jobs I'd cost him. Instead, when we sat down at a coffee shop halfway between our offices, he just looked at me for a long moment and then he said, I did something similar once. Years ago. A man took something from me and I spent 5 years destroying his life. His business, his marriage, his home. I made sure he couldn't get work in 3 counties. I made sure his investors knew he was incompetent. And you know what? When it was done, I felt empty, like I'd spent 5 years building a monument to my own anger. He paused and looked at me directly and he said, Are you happy? That question hit me hard. Was I happy? I had a successful business and power and influence, but I wasn't happy. I was hollow and tired and about to lose my daughter. So I asked Robert, Did you ever work with him again? He nodded. 15 years later, he called and wanted to bid on a project. I was surprised he'd want to speak to me, but I gave him the opportunity. He rebuilt everything from nothing. He was better the second time around, and I realized that my revenge hadn't taught him anything. The real lesson came from rebuilding. I understood what he was telling me. The builder was giving me absolution, but also a mirror. He was showing me that I had a choice to make. I could double down on this path I'd been on, could finish what I'd started, could make absolutely sure that everyone who'd wronged me understood the full extent of my power. Or I could step back and let something else happen. I could let people rebuild. I could let healing begin. I could become the kind of man who could look a child in the eye and not feel shame. The next afternoon, I drove to my son-in-law's office. He had a small space downtown now, modest but legitimate. When I walked in, he stood up immediately, probably expecting confrontation. Instead, I told him I wanted to show him something. I drove him to a piece of property that was about to go into my portfolio. It was in a good location, walking distance from downtown, close to new developments that were starting to transform the neighbourhood. It had potential. It had sat vacant for 2 years because the previous owner had been trying to sell it at an inflated price. I'd recently purchased it at fair market value. I said, I'm going to give you the first option on development here. No tricks, no traps. Just a legitimate business opportunity. I believe you can do something good with this, and I want you to succeed. Not because I've forgiven you for what you did to me, but because your success means my daughter gets to stay married to a man who feels like he's building something instead of drowning in debt. It means my grandson grows up in a house that feels stable. It means my grandchildren believe that their father is someone who can overcome failures and come back stronger. And that matters more to me than my anger. He looked at me like he was trying to understand if this was real, if I was actually offering him a path forward instead of another knife in the back. His eyes were searching mine, and I could see him trying to find the trick, the trap, the mechanism of my revenge. And then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "Can I ask you something? Why didn't you finish it? You had me completely cornered. You could have destroyed me completely, and no one would have blamed you. Why'd you stop?" I thought about that question for a long moment, and I realized that the answer was complicated and simple at the same time. Part of it was my daughter. Part of it was my grandson. Part of it was exhaustion. But part of it was something else. Part of it was that I'd become everything I hated about him when he threw me out of my house. I'd become cruel. I'd become someone willing to hurt innocent people to settle a score. I'd become the person pointing at the door and saying, "Get out!" And I didn't want to be that person anymore. So I told him. I stopped because I realized revenge doesn't heal anything. It just spreads the damage to everyone who loves the person you're destroying. My daughter was being destroyed right along with you, and that was something I couldn't live with anymore. I'd rather be the bigger person. I'd rather be the one who chose mercy. I'd rather be someone my grandson could respect. I'd rather be able to look that kid in the eye and tell him that his grandfather isn't a cruel man. I'd rather be someone worth knowing. He nodded slowly, and I saw something shift in his face. Not forgiveness of me necessarily, but understanding. The understanding that we'd both learned the same harsh lesson, just on different timelines. We'd both learned what it meant to be thrown away. We'd both learned what it felt like to lose everything, and we'd both survived. And the survival mattered more than the revenge. I left him with the property deed and the contact information for the contractors who were willing to work with him again. I told him to call me if he needed anything, and I meant it. Not because I'd forgiven him completely. Forgiveness was something that would take time, something that would need to be earned day after day through his actions. But I meant it because I decided that I was done being the man who'd been thrown out of his house. It was time to be the man who'd learned to build somewhere else. It was time to be someone different. My grandson's name is Michael. I met him 3 months after that conversation with his father. He was 4 years old, with my daughter's eyes and his father's stubbornness. My daughter brought him to my office on a Saturday afternoon, and when he walked in, he didn't know what to do. This grandfather he'd never met before, this person who was supposed to be important in some way he didn't yet understand. He was shy, and he held his mother's hand, and he looked up at me like I was a stranger, which I was. But I got down on his level, down on the floor of my office, and I asked him if he wanted to hear a story about a house. And he nodded, slowly, still uncertain. And I told him a story about a man who built a house with someone he loved, and then one day someone asked him to leave that house. And instead of breaking, instead of giving up, the man built another house, and then another one, and eventually he built a house big enough for everyone he loved, including the grandson who'd never seen the first house. And when I finished the story, Michael asked me if I still had the first house. And I said no. Sometimes you have to leave your first house so you can build a better one. And Michael seemed to accept this as profound wisdom, the way children do, and he hugged me. He hugged me like I'd just told him something that made sense of the world, and I realized that maybe I had. Maybe I had just explained my entire journey to him in a way that a 4-year-old could understand. Maybe I'd just explained that losing something doesn't mean you're lost. It just means you get to build some thing different. That night, my daughter sat with me in my office after Michael had fallen asleep on the couch. She asked me if I was okay, not whether her marriage was okay, or whether her husband was going to make it, or whether the house was saved. She asked if I was okay, and I realized that she was asking because she could see on my face that something fundamental had shifted. Something had broken open and reformed differently. Something that had been fractured for 3 years was starting to fuse back together, and I told her that I was going to be okay, that I'd spent 3 years being angry, and I was tired of being angry, that I'd spent 3 years planning revenge and I was tired of planning, that I'd spent 3 years being a man who'd been thrown out of a house and I was ready to stop being that man, that I wanted to spend the time I had left just living and building and being someone my grandson could be proud of. And she hugged me and she cried and she said that she'd never heard me sound like this before, like I was actually at peace instead of at war. And she was right. For the first time in a long time, I was at peace. Not because I'd won, not because I'd destroyed the man who'd thrown me out, not because I'd orchestrated his downfall and then magnanimously chosen to save him. I was at peace because I'd finally understood that winning wasn't the point. Living was the point. Building was the point. Being the kind of man who could look his grandson in the eye and say that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose mercy instead of vengeance. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying someone else's life. It's living so well that you don't need revenge anymore. It's building something so real and solid and meaningful that the thing someone took from you becomes irrelevant. It's becoming someone better than the version of yourself that got thrown out of a house all those years ago. It's understanding that power isn't measured by what you can take away from people. Power is measured by what you can build up, what you can restore, what you can help someone else recover after they've lost everything. That's the kind of power I wanted. That's what I've done. That's who I've become. And that's the only victory that actually matters. Everything else, all the destruction, all the planning, all the schemes to make him understand what he'd done to me, all of that was just noise. The real victory was this: my daughter back in my life, my grandson in my arms, and the knowledge that I'd chosen to be the better man, not because I had to, but because I wanted to.